When I visited Busch Gardens Williamsburg this past week to ride Pantheon, I was fortunate enough to get about 10 rides total. Although I wish I was able to get more, the park was extremely busy on both days I went, and Pantheon's wait averaged at about 45 minutes to an hour for the majority of the time. So I am fortunate that I was able to get 10 rides. Also, because of how long the lines were both days I went, I did not have time to record footage of most of the rides. That's also because in my second day, I only had 5 hours at the park, because I needed to make it to my flight. So I will not be using my own footage in this video, and I will be using copyright-free footage from YouTube. And in my defense, when I am in a somewhat time crunch and have the opportunity to get as many rides as I can, I always use that opportunity. Also, when I'm at a park, I enjoy riding a lot of coasters, some more than once, so I don't like to just stand there and just record the rides when I could be hopping on to get on some more rides. I like to enjoy myself. During the whole week before my trip to BGW, I was so hyped to ride Pantheon. Throughout the whole week, I was hyping this ride up in my head and watching so many different POVs, and at the same time, I was trying to analyze and predict the sensations felt on each element, and try to rank it even before I rode it. I was essentially putting Pantheon on a pedestal. I was also worrying all week that I wouldn't get to ride Pantheon when I went, after hearing that it closes in only 15-mile-per-hour winds. I also saw a few people saying that on one of the days they went, it was closed all day due to problems with the switch track or the LSM launch system. I do consider myself lucky, as I only had one 3-hour breakdown on my first day at the park. When I was walking into Pantheon for the first time, I saw Pantheon running and I instantly got this rush of excitement. As you can see in my vlog, I was very excited while approaching Pantheon in person, but I also expressed some of my disappointment with my overall experience at the park and the way the employees were doing things. On my first ride, I sat in the back row because everyone was saying that was the best row. Although I did find the ride to be fun, I was let down by a lot of the different elements, mainly because I hyped them up in my head all week long. Regardless of how great or legendary a roller coaster might be, the natural consequence of hyping it up in your head for a long time still exists: being disappointed. Our brains tend to exaggerate things after a period of time, so no matter how legendary the ride experience is, you will still get disappointed regardless. When I first saw the POV for this when SeaWorld released it, I predicted that it would become equally as acclaimed as Steel Vengeance because of the diverse layout, and it had every element a coaster enthusiast loves, all mixed into one layout. There was also one other thing that stood out to me about the POV. This might sound quite weird and random, but the sound of the LSM launch. Something about this noise just gets me so excited. This goes for the high-pitched shriek noise on the first launch, and also for the vibration sounds on the rest of the launches. From what it looks like, that's how it sounds like on all Intamin new generation LSM launch coasters, including Velocicoaster, but it can't be heard as well on that, because of the already existing sound effects and theming. The high-pitched shriek noise can be heard perfectly on Timmy's Half-Pipe Havoc and Sandy's Blasting Bronco. But for some reason, I don't know how to describe it, but it just sounds better on Pantheon, especially because the sound turns into a vibration all at once. I definitely have a special fetish for this specific LSM noise. This LSM noise sounds so much better in person, and you can feel the vibration of the launch while hearing the noise, which gets me so excited and adds a whole new energy feel to the ride experience. I especially like how on the first launch in the back row, you can faintly hear the shriek noise in the distance, and then you suddenly accelerate and feel the vibration of the LSMs all at the same time. As can be seen in my vlog, my initial reaction after my first ride in the back row was that I was quite underwhelmed about certain elements, but after riding it again in the front, I was no longer underwhelmed. Pantheon was definitely one of those rides where the more rides I got, the better it ranked for me. Unlike what most enthusiasts will say, Pantheon is by far a front row ride. The only elements that are slightly better in the back was the floater airtime hill on the backward spike, and the sustained ejector going down the drop. Every other element was significantly stronger in the front, with the exception of the ejector bunny hill, which was equally strong in all rows, regardless of where you're sitting. My front row night ride was also the best experience I've had in any coaster, with that pitch black darkness, which makes the ride feel so much more insane. Let me go through an element by element analysis of Pantheon. Starting out of the station, you get very weak laterals as the train maneuvers those small lateral twists. This goes for all rows. The initial kick in the first launch doesn't make a difference depending on where you sit, but the experience is different, only based on where you can start to feel and hear the LSMs. This launch was a lot more forceful than I thought it would be. It's nowhere near on par with the launches on King Ducat or TMNT Shellraiser, but its initial kick will push you back against the seat. The 0G winder after the first launch was a bit underwhelming on my first ride in the back row, along with every other element, but after a few front row rides, I've changed my mind. This has gotta be my second favorite inversion behind Velocicoaster's Mosasaurus roll. The combination of lateral whip and hang time it delivers is amazing. This element doesn't really matter that much based on where you're sitting, but I did feel it to only be slightly stronger in the front car. The ride then maneuvers a turn at the bottom of a 0G winder, and this turn was also a surprise with how much positive G's it pulled. The Outer Bank bunny hills that followed didn't deliver much airtime. From what I've noticed, it only delivered very strong laterals. The first one gives some strong laterals that will throw your body to the left, and the second one is a tad bit stronger and will throw your body to the right. Again, there wasn't that huge of a difference on how this delivered in what row, but I did find it to be a bit stronger in the front car. Also, just as a side note, I did not ride this in the middle. I only rode this in the very front row, second to front row, very back row, and second to back row. The very front row and the very back row were different from each other, but it didn't need to be a very of that row for me to get the same experience. For example, the second to front row has the exact same sensations as the very front row, and the same thing goes for the back car. The next launch also has a great kick to it regardless of where you're sitting, and at this point you can really start to feel the vibration of the LSM launch. The train then goes through a bunny hill, delivering zero airtime regardless of where you're sitting, at least not yet. The booster launch after the bunny hill vibrates even more than the first two launches, and you can strongly hear and feel the vibration of the LSMs through your seat. The train then climbs halfway into the top hat, and then falls again backwards into that same booster launch, where you can feel another strong vibration through the seats. I personally enjoy this vibration, as it adds more sensory stimulation to the ride experience. As the train gets boosted backwards, it goes through what's probably the most highly acclaimed element on the ride, the backwards bunny hill. Don't get me wrong, this hill is still up there with one of the strongest airtime moments I've experienced, but I don't feel like it lived up to how insane everyone else was saying it is. The airtime sensation this hill gives is kind of weird. Most ejector airtime hills start by throwing you up and then send you forward into the air, but because you're going backwards on this one, it starts by throwing you forward out of your seat, and then sends you backwards and then back down into your seat. I've never felt an airtime hill with that exact same sensation. When this hill does throw you up, it does it violently, but it still doesn't feel nearly as violent to me as some other ejector hills. I still find Icebreaker's second pop-up into the top hat to have slightly stronger airtime than this one. This is still one of my favorite airtime moments I've experienced, but it's not the most violent as everyone else says it is. I also felt like the airtime on this element was not very sustained. It felt like I was only being ejected for less than a second. What's also so great about the airtime on this hill, and the ride in general, is that regardless of how stapled you are, you're still going to get some wiggle room, making this a very comfortable airtime moment. This is because the seats are slightly angled downwards, which will result in the restraint not being fully flat on your lap. This bunny hill feels exactly the same regardless of where you're sitting. After you land back in your seat, you will get slightly pinched back up after hitting a part in the launch section that's not fully flat. Granted, you will not always notice the sensation if you don't actively look out for it. After going up onto the spike, you will get a slight dosage of floater airtime in the front car, and you get a stronger bit of floater airtime in the back car. You will then come back into your seat as the train levels back out into the launch track, and then you will go through that infamous ejector bunny hill one more time, but this time going forwards. Going forwards into this element doesn't have nearly as strong airtime as it does going backwards, but it does act like most other ejector moments in terms of how it throws you out of your seat. This does have some strong ejector, and I would say it's on par with the pop-up into the second brake run on Space Mountain at the Magic Kingdom. The sensation you get in this part of the ride is also kind of weird. Right when you come down from your seat after the bunny hill, you immediately hit the vibration of the LSMs as you hit the seat. It's a very weird but interesting sensation. On the top hat, you will get a strong pop of ejector airtime as the train reaches the top if you're sitting in the front car, and then get some floater airtime on the drop in the front car. In the back car, it's the absolute opposite, and you get mild floater airtime as you crest the top, and then get strong sustained ejector airtime on the drop. Strangely, this was the only drop in the park that did not drop my stomach. Every single ride at BGW dropped my stomach on some part, except for Pantheon. I generally find that the steeper the drop is, the less it drops my stomach. The valley after the top hat does pull some strong positives, but with that comes a slight rattle. The rattle wasn't noticeable, and it didn't take away from the ride whatsoever, but I noticed it a tiny bit. The giant Outer Bank hill is the element that is the most dependent on whether you sit in the front or the back cars. In the back, you will get a mix of floater airtime and laterals all the way through, but in the front, you will get a mix of laterals and strong sustained ejector airtime the whole way through. I would say this element in the front is almost on par with the Outer Bank on Steel Vengeance. Iron Gwazi's Outer Bank feels a bit different from both of them, but I felt like the one on Pantheon felt more similar to Steel Vengeance's Outer Bank. You also get opposite laterals on the way down from the element. On my front row pitch black night ride, I felt like I was floating in total darkness in the middle of nowhere on this Outer Bank. It felt so legendary. I felt like I was just floating in the air and I didn't know where the hell I was. One part after the Outer Bank that did surprise me was the low to the ground turn into the 0G stall. It actually gave some decent flow to airtime as it turned into the element. This 0G stall is definitely the best 0G stall I've experienced, but I've never been that fond of 0G stalls anyway. This one gives sustained hang time throughout in all rows, but it's not as good as the first 0G winder. You then pass through another low to the ground turn, which leads into a set of S-bends. I was expecting this element to have wicked laterals, but that expectation under-delivered in all rows. This did slightly throw you to the side, but it doesn't have as strong of laterals as the first two Outer Bank bunny hills. The final wave turn highly disappointed me on my first back row ride. I was expecting it to feel similar to Iron Gwazi's insane wave turn, but instead it just gave me weak laterals, and that's it. But in the front car, it gives you stronger laterals and gives you good ejector airtime all at once. So the wave turn is definitely a front car element. It's still nowhere near as insane as Iron Gwazi's wave turn, which gives you a violent whip in airtime, but it's still really good in the front. You then hit the brakes and the ride is over. Overall, I feel like most elements are better in the front row, which makes Pantheon a front row ride for me. If you don't want to wait for the front, then just go to the second to front, which will give you the exact same experience. Overall, I'm giving Pantheon a score of 10 out of 10. The ride itself is amazing alone. This might sound like a minor nitpick, but Pantheon sits directly beside an animal farm, and the smell of a farm is able to be smelt around the ride area, queue, station, and especially on the ride when the wind is blowing in your face. You can smell that farm smell through the wind. For me, this does ruin the immersion of the ride, but I try not to let it ruin too much of the ride for me, because I consider this coaster a best of compilation of most enthusiasts' favorite elements on a roller coaster. So, do I think this is the best multi-launch coaster in the country? No. I still slightly prefer Maverick to this, but this coaster is still nothing to sneeze at. I know I said in my vlog I ranked this lower than Velocicoaster, but after many more rides I just can't help to appreciate how good Pantheon really is, and now I rank it higher than Velocicoaster. This coaster is absolutely insane, and each element is super unique in its own way. I would almost consider this the perfect roller coaster. It just has such good variety. I know most enthusiasts like several multi-launch coasters over Pantheon, but I just can't help to say the opposite.